everyone. I'm Yael Ziegler. We're here in Israel, having had a long, hot fast day already. And for those of you in America at the beginning of your fast, we will be discussing some of the issues that have to do with the 3 weeks. Today, of course, being the first day of the 3 weeks. Particularly in light of the fact that Eikha has written a book on the 3 weeks, and recently my book on Eikha, on Lamentations, has come out. So we're going to be discussing some of these issues. I'm going to begin by dedicating the Torah that we'll be learning today to the Refuah Shlema, to the good health of Moshe ben Malka. I am wishing him a Refuah Shlema. I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation with my dear friend, Eikha, and, really to try to utilize some of the advantages of Zoom, right? We've all had a long year and a half. I think some of us have found many wonderful things with Zoom. Many of us have struggled with Zoom, but one of the perhaps most wonderful advantages of Zoom is the ability to connect people around the world. And particularly, I think it gives me really great joy to be able to have this conversation with me sitting here in Alon Shvut in Israel, and Eikha sitting in Silver Spring. I'm very happy to have this opportunity for both of us to discuss together some of the different issues that come up, some of the different thoughts that we have on the 3 weeks. I will just mention that just yesterday, I was attending a memorial shiur in memory of someone who tragically died very young, and the mother mentioned to me, without knowing that we were going to be having this discussion today, that I was going to be having this discussion between myself and Eikha today. She mentioned to me how much she appreciates Eikha's book. I'm going to hold it up for you, and how throughout the past years that she has been commemorating the tragic loss of her son, she has often taken Eikha's book with her to the kever. She finds it to be moving and meaningful and helpful. And so I hope some of you will also get a sense of why that is so today. All right, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Eikha.
Thank you. Thank you, Elle. I guess today is not a day to say it's a delight to be with you, but it is a delight and a joy in this time where we minimize our joy. I think the Lubavitch Rebbe was the one who said that Misha Nechnas Av Mima'atim Kama Besimcha, that we do everything a little bit less, but we still do it with a little bit of joy. So I actually want to add to the Refuah Shlema and also the consolation, something that I think all of us are experiencing here in the United States, was the terrible devastation of a condominium building that collapsed. I think we're going to talk a little bit, Yael, about buildings and buildings collapsing and the significance of them. And it's pretty devastating to have this as a background, so many bodies still not recovered. And I think it helps us appreciate and understand that there are things that happen in history that keep happening again and again. I want to tell you a little bit about why I wrote my book on the 3 weeks in the narrow places. And it actually just last week went up on Safaria. So you don't have to buy it. It's all free. I'm happy for people to, I think Safaria is really an amazing, just really an amazing website that has given so many people access to Torah. And I'm very proud to have that book available for free use. So I wrote I wrote on the 3 weeks because and it was part of a style of books that I have written 4 of, which is sort of everyday experiences, trying to take a season, a period of time, and make every day of it a little bit more meaningful. I think it's a huge challenge to participate in this. We're just now beginning this fast to recall the beginning of the siege of the walls of Yerushalayim, the walls of Jerusalem. And it's very, very hard because many of us are living in comfort. I'm actually, I'm not in Silver Spring right now. I'm actually in Chicago. My son and daughter and grandchildren moved to Chicago. So I'm speaking from a different part of the world. And I think I shaved about 7 minutes off of the fast. No matter where we go, perhaps with the exception of Jerusalem itself, it's very, very hard to put ourselves in the mindset of the past and to think about the devastation and loss and mourning. Rav Soloveitchik wrote very compellingly about how difficult it was for American Jews to experience tragedy at all. He felt that this sort of zeitgeist is around happiness and almost the fragility of happiness, that we have to protect it at all costs. So days like Memorial Day in America are spent with picnics and the opening of community pools. I've lived in America for quite a number of years, having left Israel, and I still cannot wrap myself around it. So I think there's a sort of willful amnesia, and it also comes at the summer. The 3 weeks come at the summer when we're sort of free of obligations, and we want to. For many American Jews, it feels like a spoiler, and I think it's not that. And I want to just say, Yael, since I got your book. I think I got your book before you got your book, because it was here in America before it went to Israel. And it's such a beautiful. It's big enough to take me through 3 weeks, possibly 4. But as you could see, I already have my stickers in it. I think it created an access point, and I want to thank you for that, to just make the central text of this season, just to deepen the experience of it and have it be more meaningful. I think for many of us, keynote the experience of being in shul on Tisha B'Av and reading these medieval acrostics, which are very, very challenging to translate, challenging to contextualize and to understand. And yet Eikha, somehow it just always resonates. You can always find something. So I guess I want to turn it back to you, Yael. Um, can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote this, how long you were working on it, and how it's changed your experience of this season?
Yeah. So, I mean, the book itself takes a long time, and it's a long time to be steeped in mourning and in difficult topics. I mean, Eikha is it's a very heavy book. It's very dense. It's filled with suffering and with the pain of the community as well as the pain of the individual. And I would even say that one of the most frequently asked questions that I got as I was writing the book was really, how I am managing to keep an upbeat attitude as I'm writing about a book which is really so filled with suffering. And it's a fair question. I mean, it's a really good question, especially because I think that I do see myself as a very positive person. I think I have quite an optimistic outlook on life. And yet, I would go from writing this book and thinking about it and right back to wonderful family things going on around me. But then, then there's Corona, which kind of hits out of the blue. I mean, I've been writing this book for 7 years. I didn't write this book because of Corona, but in a way I did, because I think that when I did think about why I chose to write about Megillat Eikha, in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the fact that these were some really difficult psukim. I mean, some of the most disturbing images that we have in the Tanakh appear in the book of Eikha. And maybe we'll talk about some of them, but, I'll just mention, mothers eating children because of famine, God as enemy, which appears only in 2 places in all of Tanakh. God as our enemy. I mean, that is almost an unbearable image. And so, when I did think about why I was writing this book, and what was the motivating factor to write this book, it's really that I thought this is simply a universal human experience. And before Corona happened, human beings contend with death on an individual basis and as a community. And Erica mentioned, these terrible events that are going on right now in Florida. We contend with this as human beings and as Jews and as individuals. And this, there's no person that doesn't at some point have to contend with the question of how we live as religious people in a world that is filled with difficulties. It's a complex world that we have. And I thought that Eikha really is the book that can be the springboard, that can offer us some of the context in which to contend with our relationship with God, our relationship with community, and our relationship with ourselves within the context of of suffering, of human suffering. And so, the fact that Corona ended up being part of the story of this book, even though I'd pretty much finished, I'd completed the writing of the book before COVID broke out. But it was there, it was in the background, is the fact that this is what we contend with as within the world in which we live. Maybe I'll turn this over to you, Eikha, and just ask you the question: what was Tisha B'Av like for you last year after the beginning of Corona? Did it change? Was it something that was part of the way that you had always experienced Tisha B'Av, or was there something different?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. In some way, given variance, we're not totally past this, so it's not as if this is ancient history. And I actually think the way that we memorialize COVID leads into a really interesting conversation around memorialization generally. It was what does it mean to live through an extremely painful experience, an experience of loss on a personal and national level, and then want to run away from it, and sort of experience life again, but know always that life is shattered. And I think we certainly, in terms of making that connection of understanding that an event that happens can have reverberations for literally centuries afterwards. So I had an interesting experience during COVID. My world, I wrote a book called In the Narrow Places, and that's an image from the first parak of Eikha that really struck me, is the way in which suffering makes one's world totally narrow, and feel constrained, and feel that is straitjacketed. So I was thinking during Corona, one of the few things that I did that gave me real pleasure was I watched a certain group of plants on my porch, and every day I would take off leaves that were dying, and I was very conscious of the spring. I was very conscious of growth and death and their relationship to each other. And certainly in plant life, one of the things that's always amazing is, you take off what's dead, and then you rejuvenate the plant, or a plant that hasn't been watered in a long time suddenly comes back to life. It's an image actually captured in Eov, contrasting human mortality to trees that sort of rejuvenate. And then the isur of not planting, which is based in Eikha 2:6, that isur became very alive to me in a way that it hadn't. I think all of us experience at different times halachot that become more real to us, that we observe more seriously because we have some kind of personal experience that tunes us into its significance. And all of a sudden, I recall that there was an isur, and I gave a shiur on it last Tisha B'Av. There's an isur of planting, and it's not planting in the sense of difficult work. It's what the Gemara and later on categorized in the Shulchan Aruch talks about joyful planting, right? That when you plant something and you see it as an aspect of all growth, of the vitality of all things. And so I began to understand why we're not permitted to plant in this time. So that's just one small example of how I think I experienced Tisha B'Av differently, and really understood that the things that we celebrate most are things where we see progress and advancement and beauty, and that creating a narrow world of suffering means eliminating all of those. C.S. Lewis wrote, I think that one of the most magnificent general books on grief was his book called A Grief Observed, when he lost his Helen, or Joy as he called her, his wife of only a few years. But he wrote a very small book. It was actually given to me by Mayor Soloveitchik as a gift. And it's a book that really, I think, captures the idea that, when you're grieving and when you experience loss, things that other people do that are very simple, like he talks about other people shaving, or other people laughing, or other people getting dressed. I mean, all those daily activities take on a whole different patina for you. And you almost think, how can anybody laugh when this has happened? I imagine if you were, if you were living in that building and you'd survived in Florida, you were thinking, how can anybody go to the beach and walk and enjoy themselves? And I think it shows us that people have very, very different experiences, even when they're in the same space. Yeah, even when they're in the same space. And I know, Yael, I'd like to ask you about something you talk about when you're talking about the theology of the book. To go from kind of a small experience of planting to a larger experience of sort of existentially questioning God's existence, which happens here. You talk about three different approaches to the theology of Eikha, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Okay, I remember to unmute, which is the important point. Well, I'm going to just push aside for a moment your question about the theology, if I may, because it struck me when you were talking about the planting that, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting. I had a very similar experience in my garden. One of the first things I did when we had our first lockdown in Israel, which was, in the beginning of the spring, was go out and buy as many colored plants as I could and plant them everywhere I could. And it gave me a certain kind of sense of joy at watching something growing, even as we were, as you said, kind of, withdrawing into our personal world. But it struck me that, the idea that we don't plant, during the 3 weeks, that there's something, that we're trying to prevent ourselves from that kind of joy and looking at growth. But it struck me that in just a month from now, here in Israel, we're going to be starting observing Shemitah, which is a different sort of not planting. And it just struck me as you were talking that there's something remarkable about the movement from this very difficult period of Corona. And as Eikha said, we're not out of the period. Certainly the world isn't. And in Israel, we've had an uptick in the last few days. We had the masks off and now we have the masks on again. And it all is, very sort of tenuous. But at the same time, this idea of Shemitah is a different sort of not planting, right? It's a not planting for the purpose of putting our trust in God, right? It's not planting because we're saying, well, we're mourning. We're trying to have an opposite experience of growth. It's now we're going to place our trust in God bringing us joy, in God bringing us growth. Eikha, you mentioned that the prohibition of not planting is based in Perek Bet Pasuk Vav of Megillat Eikha, right? And in the very next pasuk, we have this in Perek Bet Pasuk Zayin, we have this description of God destroying Yerushalayim. And he's destroying, no, I'm sorry, it's in the very same pasuk. In the same pasuk, in pasuk Vav, we have God destroying his moed, right? We have him destroying his house. We have him destroying Shabbat, and we have him destroying the Melech and the Kohen. Now, whenever I read that pasuk, I think God is destroying the three spheres of Kedusha, of holiness. He's destroying Kedushat HaMakom, holiness of place. He's destroying Kedushat HaZman, holiness of time. And he's destroying Kedushat HaAdam, holiness of person. And it all happens in this one fell swoop of destroying Yerushalayim, destroying the Beit HaMikdash. Everything comes crashing to the ground. And what I think is almost a tikkun for this is Shemitah, right? Because Shemitah, which, emerges at the end of Sefer Vayikra, is really kind of gathering together all of the themes of holiness that are developed in the book of Vayikra. And it's telling us, you can use Shemitah to kind of rebuild and to consciously appreciate Kedushat HaMakom, right? Holiness of place, which is, leaving the land fallow and showing that this place belongs to God. It's holiness of time because it's every seventh year. And it's holiness of person because we set the slaves free on the 7th Shemitah, right, in the Yovel year. And so we almost have, Shemitah exists as a tikkun for the Chorban, for a period in which God, kind of reverses all of our goals. And so maybe there is something, I don't know, something Corona related about moving into this period of Shemitah when we are sort of consciously recognizing that we are looking to allow God into our lives, allow God to bring growth into our lives. It's just something that sort of struck me when you were speaking.
I love that. I never thought about Shemitah that way, and that's a really helpful sort of um, overarching theme. I guess I'm thinking a little bit about Adam 1 and Adam 2 in Lonely Man of Faith and Rav Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith, and in a way, Shemitah forces human beings to put aside the Adam 1, the builder, right, the man of cognition, the person who needs to till the land and grow things, and move to Adam 2, who's sort of writing poetry and looking at the beauty of something and being able to say there's something holy about letting go of control and relinquishing control. If you can't sort of balance your Adam 1 and your Adam 2 internally, Shemitah sort of forces that upon you to say you have to relinquish. I mean, I know that we have always all kinds of legal loopholes to get around this, but in principle, the idea is that a human being has to relinquish control. And I think in some way, the Churban is the ultimate experience on that sort of line of experiences of learning that you can't control everything. Is that when you suffer, it's sort of a slap in the face to a human being saying, you thought you were in charge here. I need to remind you that when you get too haughty, when you and you write very compellingly in the book around the residents of Yerushalayim feeling they were secure, and that the Eikha was secure, that they were secure, that they had defeated Sancheiriv, they defeated an enemy, and they were already in a sort of in a surprise act of victory of the underdog, and that overconfidence sort of contributes to that feeling we're in control, and then we get these reminders that we're really not in control. I know that we both talked about, because here we are, both women writing about this tragedy. And I think there is something very, very female about the book of Eikha. I've certainly talked about it, and I hope I'm going to get to the point where you talk about it. All the female images of women, sort of, we begin as as the woman who is mourning, right? She's just, Sion is a woman who's alone, and there are all kinds of images throughout the book. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that sort of personification of suffering as a woman.
Yeah, I mean, this is really an important theme in Eikha. That's how we open the book, right? Eikha yashva vadad ha'ira bati am hayata ke'almana, right? The city is personified as a woman, and of course, she is a widowed woman, right? Which is an extraordinarily painful image, right? And actually, what's interesting is that we don't know who her husband is, right? Is it the people, right? Is it the residents of Yerushalayim? Is it God? I mean, is it theologically tenable to say that she is widowed from God? I mean, that seems to be a very kind of problematic theological image. Of course, Rashi points out it's ke almana. She's like a widow. She's, of course, not an actual widow. But that's not the only image of Jerusalem. And in general, throughout the Tanakh, cities are women. This is not unique to Jerusalem, right? Nineveh is a woman in the book of Nahum, and Bavel is a woman in Yeshayahu, Perek Mem Zayin. And, cities are women. And actually the word ir for city is a feminine word, right? Even though it doesn't sound like one, right? But, the other very predominant image of the city as woman is city as mother, right? And that is, I think, as you mentioned, Erica, I mean, I think anybody who is a mother is immediately drawn to those images, and particularly what is so disturbing about those images, not just city as wife, but city as mother. And in Perek Aleph, it's a mother who is contending with the loss of her child, which is an extremely painful and poignant and unnatural image, right? That's what, if the loss of her husband represents the loss of her present, maybe the loss of her existential security, she feels vulnerable, certainly economically, this would be a very unstable image. But the loss of her children, well, that's the loss of her future, right? I mean, that's really a terrible and poignant image. And those two images each represent something different. But I think what's particularly disturbing, and I noted this before, but I think anybody who encounters Eikha, I think would immediately sense that this is the most disturbing image in Eikha, and that is the image of the mothers eating their children, which in some way is describing the city, right? The city is the mother, and the city is no longer a nourishing place. It's no longer a safe haven. It's no longer a place of growth. It's no longer a place of, spiritual well-being. It's a place which consumes its inhabitants, right? So, on one level, I think that's what the image of, the mother consuming her child is. But, I think it also actually is a real image. It's an image of the horrors of famine. What famine does to human beings. It doesn't just take away their food and their physical survival, but it takes away their morality, right? And it reduces them to, to these the very opposite of images of compassion. I will say one more thing, and then I want to turn the question back to you, Eikha, because I think I'm sure you have a lot to say about this as well. I will say one more thing about the image of women eating their children, which, as I said, I mean, it's almost difficult to even say those words. We have it once in Perek Bet, we have it again in Perek Daled. In the 4th chapter of the book of Eikha, we have a description of Yedei Nashim Rachmaniot Bishlu Yaldehen. The hands of compassionate women cook their children. Now, there's a lot to say about this image, but I just want to say one thing about the word Rachmaniot, right? Rachmaniot, of course, means compassionate, right? Compassionate women. But it is absolutely etymologically related to the word Rechem, which means womb, right? And I don't think, and Chazal make this point as well. There's a midrash in Devarim Rabbah which says the word rachamim comes from the word rechem. The word in Hebrew for compassion, it comes from the womb. And I think the idea is not that everyone who has a womb is compassionate, or that anyone who doesn't have a womb is not compassionate. I see some men on this as well. So I'll assure you, that's not what it means. What it means is that the basis for compassion in the world is childbearing, right? And when the figures of that represent childbearing, the mothers, no longer have compassion, this represents the loss of compassion from humanity. And that's part of the description of the horrors of the Chorban. It's not just that we have lost our children, it's or our city. It's that we've lost what makes us human and what makes us good.
Yeah, I was I just want to make sure I'm unmuted. Yeah. I also, I mean, I feel that there's a progression in the Sefer, that when we begin with the image of Eikha Yashva Badad, as we're looking at her, we're feeling compassion towards her, we're feeling her deep sadness, right? And even that, I think the text is pretty graphic, bring us into her small corner, right? And it was giving us the image of crying and the tears on her face. And Ein La Menachem Mikol Aveha, she has no friends to come and comfort her. I think all of us go through experiences where we feel this profound loneliness, and no one can really understand what it is that we're going through, because if you haven't experienced it yourself, and even if you have experienced it, you haven't experienced it in quite that way. I think, the way that Yirmiyahu captures this, I almost felt like when I'm reading it, it was written by a woman, but I think the fact that it's written by a man really strikes us as someone who could observe and understand that if you want to capture vulnerability and frailty, you'll have a woman in loss and a woman who loses her child. And again, that image of Kol Rodfeha Hisigua Ben Amtsarim, right? That was why I chose that title. You know, she can't find any peace, and she's running away, and she gets stuck. And just for a minute, because I think we talk about the 3 weeks and as Benam Tsarim, as being in this strait of difficulty, but not really imagining what it's like to be a woman, maybe running down an alley and then realizing the alley is narrowing and your enemy is on the other side, and you recognize that every part of you now is going to be subject to someone else's strength, someone else's pitilessness, someone else's cruelty. And and then later on in the same parak, another image that's always struck me is tumata bishuleha, that her tuma, her impurity, is on her skirt. The idea of her bleeding and other people seeing that, I mean, it just being ultimately sort of humiliating, not being able to keep all the things that are private really private. And I think the use of female imagery is extremely effective in this book, but I also understand that because of it, it's another reason that people who can't experience sadness pull away, because it is, as you pointed out, so graphic. Every time I read that about women eating their children, I cry. I'm a mother. I'm a grandmother. I feel profoundly what it must have taken to go from the images of women, vulnerable women in chapter 1, to the progression that as we get closer to the end of the Sefer, the very women we're supposed to have compassion for, we can't feel compassion. We can't understand how anyone would do that. And that reminds us that we actually can't understand what it's like to be in someone else's, place of suffering. So I think about that a lot. I want to return to something we talked about earlier, Yael, which is because this suffering is so graphic and so theologically problematic. Part of me understands why in the Jewish community at large, outside of the Orthodox community, almost no one observes this day. So I'm wondering, when you were writing this, were you thinking that this is going to be sort of a narrow book that's going to be focused on an audience who really understands that without memory we become weaker, more shallow, less interesting, less able to manage the range of human emotions? I was just wondering, as you were writing it, if you were thinking that.
Well, I mean, if I was thinking specifically about the,
Readership and
yeah.
how writing on this particular, I mean, I did, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I'm wondering if you had that experience.
Well, so I mean, on the one hand, I think that I was very aware of the much broader application that this book has. It is a universal experience, and therefore there are some really, I think, important universal themes in the book. The idea that you were really saying, which is that suffering produces introspection, and a life examined generates a purposeful life. I mean, that's part of what I think this book is trying to do. It's trying to direct our attention to thinking more deeply about what it means to be human, what it means to be in a world which is not free of pain. And as you said, Eikha, there is perhaps a tendency to try to kind of, put on blinders and create a certain happiness and not necessarily focus on suffering, on some of the more difficult and more disturbing experiences of what it means to be human. But I think that is a very universal experience. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, Eikha is very much a book about the Jewish experience. It's about the experience of the people of Israel during the course of biblical history, and specifically the events of the destruction of Yerushalayim, the loss of political autonomy, the loss of a certain kind of of close and intimate interaction with God that took place in Yerushalayim, surrounding the Beit HaMikdash and service in the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore, there's a very strong particularistic bent in this book. I would even maybe go so far as to say that the 4 chapters that surround the book are really very nationalist chapters. They're really about Am Yisrael. They're really about the people of Israel. But the central chapter, it's really just about the Gever, right? And we were talking before about the image of the city as a woman, and that's a very powerful image. And by the way, I will just mention, it's one that God adopts as well, right? In other words, when God wants to kind of restore the people's trust in him as a compassionate God, he uses images of motherhood, right? Both in, the famous passage in Yirmiyahu, right? Haven yakir li Ephraim im yeled shashuim, right? My Ephraim is my beloved son, my delight. But also in one of the nivuot that we read in Yeshayahu, right? Where one of the nivuot of Nechama, which we read in Yeshayahu, where we hear Yerushalayim saying, wow, God has abandoned me, azavani Hashem shchechani, God has forgotten me. And God's wonderful response, which I think is very much relates to what we see in Eikha, is, right, hatishkach isha ula merachem ben bitna. Can a woman forget her child? Can a woman stop having compassion on the fruit of her womb, right? And then God says, well, maybe there are certain circumstances in which a woman could. We just read Megillat Eikha, gam eila tishkachna va'anochi lo eshkach, right? Va'anochi lo eshkachech. Even if the women do forget, I am the ultimate mother, right? So there's this kind of comfort that we get from this image as a mother that we get from God. But, back to your question, and that is that I think that the central chapter is a very universal chapter. When I was writing about it, I was really thinking about how every human being, this should be required reading for every human being. And the ones that surround it speak more to the Jewish experience. And now I'm going to turn the question back to you, Eikha.
Well, I guess being here in the United States has made me think a lot about why, outside of Orthodoxy, Tisha B'Av, I'm not even sure people really know what Tisha B'Av is, or what the 3 weeks is, certainly, or maybe it's sort of a vague memory of one's grandparent, or something that one's read about. It gets very, very little coverage as opposed to before a major holiday, Jewish holiday, the Jewish newspapers, whether it's Tablet or Ford or the Times of Israel, will cover, we'll have lots of readings, and that's not the case here. Chancellor Isamar Schorsch, when he was the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote about, and I wrote about this in the Narrow Places, had suggested that we eliminate Tisha B'Av. And what's so striking to me is that when it comes to the Holocaust is such a master narrative for American Jews, for Jews globally, and yet there's an inability to see that master narrative is part of a larger story, that is a religious story, but it's also a Zionistic story, and it's also a story of human suffering, as you pointed out, Yael, of human loss, that helps people understand the idea of a range of emotions. And I say that because I think a lot of people get to this season and they just say, I don't want to be unhappy, so I'm not going to be unhappy. And I'll keep halachic observance. And I actually wanted to read something from the book, with your permission, about this idea of sort of thinking about halachic observance, but in a very, very limited way, not allowing it to be the leverage for one's true and deep feelings. Hold on, let me just find this for a sec. trying to look at my own book, but so even I'll read a passage, and I hope you'll read some of your book, Yael. Even when we recognize the cognitive importance of recalling the past, we're not always capable of rising to the emotional challenge of reliving it. Instead, we often find ourselves immersed in the particularities of Jewish law, reviewing the minutiae of observance, not always as a preparation for this period, but often as a distraction. If we lose ourselves in the questions of whether or not to listen to music on a radio, buy particular objects of clothing if they're discounted, or engage in instructional swimming, we may avoid the more essential task of the season, creating genuine sorrow over the incalculable loss of our Jewish spiritual center. We measure ourselves by outward displays of mourning, the unshaven beard, the unironed clothes, the limitations on external expressions of happiness, but the heart often remains untouched. The halachic restrictions of the period help us structure our worlds to minimize joy, but they cannot force sadness. They can only minimize the conditions for happiness. And that's something I thought about a lot in writing this. And it's one of the reasons that I wrote it as a daily, a small essay to read every day, so that people could sort of, could it help them in some way trigger an expression or a thought, to maybe go back to that place, or think about the consequences of that experience and grow personally from it every day. I wrote a book called Take Your Soul to Work, which I have now as a daily podcast, which was 365 sort of small observations for leaders. Or my Haggadah also has an essay for every day. Or I wrote Return, which was on, the 10 days, an essay for every day of the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I think we need those reminders, and we need them every day. I'm not suggesting that I was I was able to achieve what I had sought to achieve, but I think that experience, because just a generalized sense of we should be sad now doesn't really work. I will say something I told Yael. I actually wrote this book for a mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, for a really not good reason. I had written 4 books with a wonderful Jewish publisher, but I wanted to write for the Orthodox audience. And the only way you can, when you write for most publishers, they have the first right of refusal on your next book. And I couldn't think of how to get out of the contractual obligation. It was very nice that they wanted to buy my books, but I wanted to expand the audience, and they weren't particularly interested in the Orthodox audience. So I thought to myself, what can I do to get out of this? What can I write about that will be of no interest to the non-Orthodox community? I said, I'll write a book on the 3 weeks. And if you purchase the book, you'll notice it's a very short book. It was a book that was written for one purpose, but in the writing of the book, I really became very deeply involved in thinking about this season and the way in which it represents a season of human experience. And sure enough, when I told the publisher, I said, well, I'm going to write my next book on the 3 weeks. He said, oh, only Orthodox people will read that. We're not interested. And I say that as a sad story, because everyone experiences suffering. Everyone experiences the collapse of dreams and the collapse of structures that held them close. I'm just reading a book now by Bruce Feiler. I think it's a really important book called that just came out. Life is in the transition. He talks about life disruptors and life quakes, and that people go through about 36 different disruptors in their lives that require lots of different transition. We all need to think about suffering and have a vocabulary and have rituals and have means of managing it. And yet we think that if we don't talk about it, it's going to go away. And I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about that not only for the general community of human beings, being a citizen of the world, but I'm concerned about for American Jewry, that this sort of willful amnesia it doesn't help in the process of suffering. And I'll turn over to you, Yael. I just picked a selection from my book. I'd love to hear something that you're thinking about, that you wrote about, that you say, oh, I love this paragraph, or this paragraph was very meaningful to write.
So first of all, I just want to say that I think that the structure of your book with the daily kavanah and the way that, it gives food for thought at the end of each day, and the daily experience of taking something to think about that you could really think about throughout the course of that day, it's extremely helpful. Again, as you said, because I think people do struggle with how to experience the 3 weeks. And so I think that that's really, it doesn't matter whether you're by that purpose or not. I think in the end, it's an extremely helpful way to go about encountering the 3 weeks. I'll just pick up on something else that you said, which is that, this idea that we kind of get bogged down with some of the details, the can't listen to music, can't shave, can't buy new clothes. And then, within that, to kind of scratch the surface and really find what is really going on here, what we're really meant to be doing, and the kind of introspection and thoughts that should be guiding our experience in the 3 weeks, it's sometimes lost in the shuffle. And what I think is interesting in the book of Eikha is that we have really a very brief encounter with practical acts of mourning, and that is in Perek Bet, in Pasuk Yud, when we have the older men, right? Yeshvu la'aretz yidmu ziknei bat Zion, right? The elders of Zion are sitting on the floor. What are they doing? They're putting afar al rosham, they're putting dust on their head, chagru sakim, they're putting on sackcloth, right? And they're experiencing mourning in perhaps the only really formal way that we have an experience of mourning in the book. So what the book is telling us is yes, that is part of mourning, but it's certainly not the bulk of what's going on in Megillat Eikha. So what is really going on in Megillat Eikha? So of course we have at the forefront the description of the pain, the description of the suffering. Previously, Eikha asked about how I understand the theology of the book. And so I'll go back to that question now in trying to explain what I really think we are meant to be doing during these 3 weeks, because the book itself is not a book of theology. Right? I mean, that's really what I start out saying at the beginning of my book. This is not an Eov-like book. This is not a Kohelet-like book. This is not a book that is tackling theology, right? But what it does very beautifully is it kind of subtly talks about theology. And I saw that Ora Mozak, and I don't see you on screen, but I saw your comment before, asked the question about sins. And I actually think that that's somewhat missing from Eikha as well. We have a sense of sinfulness, but this is not a book of a prophet who is lambasting the Jewish people for the sins. No, this is a book of suffering. This is a book that is giving us a context within which to encounter God through suffering. So in that sense, it is a book of theology, even though it's not directly doing theology. Now, I'm going to read a passage where I do talk from my book, where I do talk about what I think the theology of the book of Eikha is. And this is, both an answer to Erica's earlier question, and also an answer to, what we're really trying to talk about here today in this conversation, which is, what are the tools that we have to take us through the 3 weeks? And what I wanted to claim in my book, and what I kind of weave throughout the whole book, is that the book of Eikha has a very particular structure. So that the structure of the book of Eikha are these concentric circles that surround the middle chapter. It's called a chiastic structure. It means that chapters 1 and 5 have a similar kind of idea, and chapters 2 and 4 have a similar kind of idea, and they all revolve around the core middle chapter. And so the way that I see this structure is that once you see this structure, you're going to see the theology of Eikha, which is what really gives us the tools to contend with suffering. So I'm reading for you from the final chapter of my book, where I say as follows: the structure of the book reflects its theological complexity. It offers two divergent approaches to suffering and God. One that portrays humans coming to terms with God's actions and acknowledging that they are justified. That's where, what Ora asked about with regard to the sins, that's where we have in chapters 1 and 5, that's where we have an acknowledgement that we must have done wrong if this happened. There's an acknowledgement of what we call tziduk hadin, justifying God, theodicy. Tzadiku Hashem kifihu mariti. God is just. I must have rebelled against him. And yet, there is another approach, which we find in chapters 2 and 4, in which humans resist reconciliation, maintaining a defiant posture of incomprehension and outrage, right? There's two totally different perceptions of God in the book of Eikha, right? Chapters 1 and 5 illustrate the need to be people of simple faith, to have what we call emuna pshuta, to have a belief in divine justice, in living in a world which is meaningful, right? I mean, one of the things that I think is important is that, without this type of faith, we're living in a dark and absurd world, right? A world that things don't make sense. So that's what kind of, creates a periphery for the book, a buffer for humans to contend with God. And yet, and here I'm again reading from my book. On the other hand, Eikha does not rest upon simple formula or facile answers in confronting preeminent theological quandaries. Chapters 2 and 4 confront the world's absurdities and tragedies with shock frankness. Pat answers cannot explain the death of children or human suffering. Mass tragedy, illness, and suffering are inexplicable. These are also undeniable components of the human struggle to understand God. So we have these kind of two poles in Eikha, what I call the sufferer's theological experience, which represents a kind of a tangled fluctuation between theodicy on the one hand and outrage on the other hand, right? And I think that this is, in my mind, this is the human experience. We live with a sense of belief in God. Otherwise, the world seems absurd. And yet, at the same time, we contend with a world where the absurdities of human existence emerge, and they are glaring. And so maybe I'll just conclude by saying something about that middle chapter, right? Because the middle chapter, one of the things that people have been asking me since my book came out is why I chose this cover, right, for my book, which the simple answer is I didn't want to put a picture of Yerushalayim burning on the cover of the book. It seemed a little depressing, but also because of what I really think about the structure of the book, which is that Eikha's structure mirrors a turbulent storm, right? There's a certain turbulence going on in this Van Gogh picture in Starry Night, and that the central chapter is the eye of the storm, so that misery and suffering can swirl around us. And we don't ignore those powerful winds that encircle us. But what we have at the eye of the storm is tranquility and faith, the tranquility and faith that rest at the core of every human being. What Eikha teaches us is that human resilience is something which exists at the core of every person, just as we find it at the core of the book of Eikha. And I'll just conclude by reading my very last sentences of the book. I don't know if I'm giving away the ending, but at the very end of the book, I write, at Eikha's core, we find human tenacity and optimism, fueled by abiding faith in God's righteousness and compassion. God's ways are eternal. They renew themselves daily, even if humans do not always comprehend. Hope for good prevails. As it turns out, calamity does not necessarily destroy one's convictions. Instead, it can enable us to discover them. The experience of adversity can foster faith in a turbulent world. And maybe I'll take this opportunity to turn back to Eikha and ask Eikha, we've during these 3 weeks, on the one hand, we experience a lot of suffering and a lot of difficulty. And yet I look at Eikha, I see a very upbeat person who lives with a lot of joy. And so maybe I'll ask you where you found optimism in as you were writing this book and as you were exploring some of the difficult aspects of human existence.
Yeah, well, I did write a book on death, so I'll just put that out there. But I actually, my book on scandal that I wrote was harder than the book on death. I think because I felt frustrated, death has to happen and scandal doesn't have to happen, and so that was, that was interesting for me. Um, it wasn't so much when I wrote this. When I wrote my book, Happier Endings on Death, a few weeks after that, one of my very, very close friends died, and I could not go on book tour. I just felt like it was very close. One of the great things about book writing, is that you work on things and then you send them off to your editor and then you get them back. So there was always a little bit of psychic relief in the break, which was really important for me. I take my cue a little bit from, I'm not afraid to talk about sad things. I think it's important. I think it contributes to a person's maturity and capacity to hold that range. In art, when you have a value, it's for the within one color, let's say green, you take the lightest to the very darkest, and right, that's the value of that color, that range. And when paintings look really alive, it's because there's a lot of color, there's a lot in that range. That's so, for example, if you were to paint plants, or any greenery, any vegetation, and you only used one green, nothing would look real. And I say that because that's something that's very hopeful for me, is that when you're in a range of something, you're in a really deeply authentic experience of it. And I like, in the experience of classroom teaching, to have moments where everyone's laughing, and moments that are more sobering, and moments where you sort of have some of the deeper questions, and then you're in the mid range. I think if you have any experience that is too tense and too dense for a long period of time, you become unable to withstand it. But I'll share with you a moment, and this will be like my sort of closing remark. Um, I was I was in Italy with my family many years ago, and we went to the Colosseum. And if you're a student of Jewish history, you know that this was not a place where Jews were treated kindly. Jews had served as, were forced into being gladiators, and anyway, if you know the history, you know that I wasn't having the tourist experience everybody else was having, and I was extremely actually depressed, and I went by myself to the Arch of Titus. I was with my family, and then I took a walk on my own, and I just surveyed the landscape. And if you're a Talmud reader, you know this landscape in some way, and it was so overwhelming, and images of cruelty were so pervasive for me, and it was really, really difficult. Anyway, as we were leaving, I had an experience which shifted it completely. There are people who dress as gladiators, and you can give them €1 and you can take a picture. They're in their sort of red outfits and fake plastic gladiator hats. Anyway, as we're walking by, and my husband and sons wear kippot, so one of the gladiators said, "Manishma," and I remember all of a sudden it was such a strange experience, and an experience I've spoken, written about, because it was also a very profound experience. Yes, there was suffering. Yes, there's tragedy. Yes, Jews have been victims of persecution. Yeah, we didn't even talk about current anti-Semitism, and another reason to read this book, where the Jewish people feel, like we read in this past week's parsha, right? Hein am badad yishkon, right? Like we're the that lives alone. And I think it was really painful to have that observation. And then on the other hand, Hebrew is a language that was revived in our own country, in our homeland, and I think anyone who I've gone to the Kotel for Tisha B'av, and you feel that morning, and you feel that you only have the outer wall, but then you turn around and you see the old city of Jerusalem, and you see life and vibrancy and vitality, and I think being able to deepen our experience of suffering has helped us throughout our lives. In the Deuteronomic expression "V'chai b'hem," it's helped us really live. And I just want to thank you for this book. I'm looking forward to spending the 3 weeks, because it's going to take me that long to just go through it and really delve into its verses. And you've made the season more meaningful for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Eikha. Thank you for your book and for this conversation. And for ending on that note, maybe I'll just pick up on someone just now said, who was it? Someone said the centrality of Yerushalayim. I can't see who wrote that comment. Oh, Rebecca. Okay, so Rebecca spoke about the centrality of Yerushalayim, and that's really, I think, one of the things that was able to keep me optimistic and even-keeled as I wrote this book. And I watched, as I was thinking about some of the more difficult period in Jewish history, I was also watching some of the prophecies of Shivat Zion, of the return to Zion, come alive, right? The prophecy of Zechariah in chapter 8, where he talks about the streets filling up with children playing and older people walking with their cane. And that's, of course, a contrast to the streets that we have in Eikha, which are filled with corpses. And we have a great privilege today for those of us who live in Israel, for those of us who come to Israel, for those of us who love Israel and are watching with both concern but also great love some of the dreams of setting up the land of Israel that we've been fortunate to experience in the past 70 plus years. So this is a great privilege. And I will say it was a great privilege to write about the book of Eikha while watching some of these wonderful prophecies, really come to life around me. So I'll thank all of you for joining us today in this conversation. I wish you all a meaningful 3 weeks, a meaningful rest of today and leading up to the 9 days and to Tisha B'Av. And it was wonderful to spend this hour with you, this part of the fast with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.